All right, welcome back, guys. We are going to be into our knowledge pack once again today. We are going to do 1.2. All life is made of cells. So, what we're doing from here after 1.1 is we're going to take a look at those 7 characteristics of life again, but we're going to go through one at a time and focus in on them just a little bit more. All right, so what's going on in this unit is, or this lesson, is that we're going to take a look at cells. Surely you learned about them in 7th grade life science, but we're going to maybe take a look at it in a slightly different way. We're going to do a little comparison, and we're going to see what really makes a cell. What does a cell really need in order to carry out life processes? All right, so here's kind of a cool image. This is a plant cell. You can actually see some unique, interesting structures in here. We can see the nucleus in the middle. We can see the big thick green cell wall in here, a giant vacuole, probably some chloroplast and things in there. All right. So what is a cell really? Well, we want to make this as simple as possible. A cell is just the simplest unit of life. It's the smallest thing capable of carrying out all 7 of those characteristics of living things. So as we talk in this lesson, let's focus on the following concepts: structure and function. That is, the structure of a cell is what gives it its function. Okay. We're also going to do some comparing and contrasting between different types of cells. We're going to take a look at the 2 main types of cells on planet Earth: the simple prokaryotic cells and the much more complex eukaryotic cells. Now, the term cell is kind of an interesting one. It actually gets its origin from an English scientist named Robert Hooke. And when he looked at cork bark, he thought that the individual cells of a cork bark reminded him of the tiny rooms that monks lived in their monasteries, also known as cells. We still use the term today for tiny cells or for tiny rooms, such as a jail cell. All right, so let's take a look at the forms of the way life comes in different forms here. I'm going to move me a little bit here. So first off, here's an organism called a euglena. That's actually a group of organisms, and each one of these is an organism made of only one cell, and that's its entire body. Okay, so this cellular arrangement, when you're made of one cell, is known as a unicellular organism, an organism made of only one cell, from the word uni, meaning one, and then cellular, cell, so one cell. Now, some organisms, ourselves included, in fact, most of the organisms you would see with the naked eye are in fact made of loads of cells. Here is a simple algal species known as Volvox, and you can actually see the individual cells that a Volvox is made of. So whenever an organism is made of multiple cells, 2 or more, we call that a multicellular organism. Very simple. Made of more than one cell. Now, that can be, just a few cells like these Volvox, or it can be something like us humans with about 100 trillion cells in our bodies alone. All right, so let's take a look at the necessary components of all cells. So in middle school and in most biology textbooks, you're going to see these really complex drawings of cells with tons of different structures in there. Things like the nucleus and the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi bodies, the vesicles. But what of that stuff in there must a cell absolutely have? And it turns out there's really only 4 things that all cells have to have in order to survive, to meet all of those demands that life places on it. So we're going to take a look at those here. All right, so over on the left-hand side here, I've got the simplest cell. Okay, now this is a hypothetical cell having only the parts that must be in all cells. Now, pretty much all cells are going to have a lot of other things too, but these are the necessary ones. All right, so first off, all cells must have DNA. Okay, so in our diagram here, this little squiggly thing in the middle, that's going to be our DNA. And the reason we need that is it's basically going to provide the instructions for building the cell, for regulating the cell, for maintaining the cell, and driving all of those cellular processes. Okay, next thing we're going to need is we're going to need to encapsulate that DNA in something. We need to contain it. Remember, that's essentially what a cell is. It's a container of chemical reactions. So for that, we're going to need the plasma membranes circling the cell here. Now, plasma membranes are a double layer, which is why you see 2 lines in this diagram. So its job is going to be to hold the cell together and exert control over what gets into that cell and what's going to come out of that cell. All right, the next thing we're going to need is we're going to need some way of having chemical reactions occur in the cell. In order to do that, we need water. We need liquid inside the cell containing chemicals that can do all of those necessary chemical reactions. That's where the cytoplasm comes in. So most of the inside of this cell right here is going to be sort of the ooey gooey goodness, the juice on the inside. That's the cytoplasm, okay? This is going to facilitate those chemical reactions that drive the metabolism of the cell. And lastly, we're going to need some way to build the materials that a cell needs that's coded in on its DNA. For that, we're going to need these little tiny structures in here called ribosomes, which are basically protein factories, okay? They're molecular machines that read the information that comes from DNA and actually put it into action, build the materials that the cell needs, or the products. All right, now let's take a look at the two different big wide categories of cells. There's two main categories of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So we're going to build a little truth table in our notes to take a look at the different types. Okay, let's start with prokaryotes, okay? So we're going to look at the following things. We're going to look at the size of the cells, the age, complexity, their structures, and some example groups in there as well. All right, so let's begin here with our prokaryote. Our prokaryotes are going to be the smallest cells. Things like bacteria are prokaryotes. We're going to pretty much need a microscope to see these guys. Now, prokaryotes are the oldest type of cell on Earth. We think that they were the first type of cell to evolve, and all of the other life forms essentially evolved from prokaryotes, including the more complex eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are the simplest of all cells. They have the fewest structures, and they have very simple lifestyles for the most part. They are typically unicellular. You don't really find multicellular prokaryotes, although you may find prokaryotes living in colonies or clusters, which makes them look like multicellular organisms, but really they're pretty much all unicellular. They only have one chromosome of DNA. Unlike, for example, humans, we have 46. Our chromosomes are long strands, but in prokaryotes, they're all circles. So it's still a long piece of DNA, but it circles around and connects to itself. In a prokaryote, this big single chromosome is known as a nucleoid, not to be confused with the nucleus. As far as structures go, prokaryotes don't have a lot of specialty structures. They have a few simple basic ones, and none of them are bound in a membrane on the inside, unlike in eukaryotes. There's no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, just simple structures based on protein and RNA. Okay? Our example groups that we're going to take a look at in this class are the kingdoms of life known as bacteria or eubacteria, and a group of other prokaryotes known as archaeans. Now, we're going to contrast that now with the eukaryotes. Here is a single-celled eukaryote known as a paramecium. You can already see that there's a lot of materials in there. They're fairly complex. Okay, now in the eukaryotes, they are typically much larger than the prokaryotes. In fact, several hundred to several thousand prokaryotes can fit in a single eukaryotic cell. They are the youngest cells, whereas prokaryotes have been around for about 4 billion years, eukaryotes have been around for about 1 billion years. And they most likely evolved when large prokaryotes actually ingested smaller prokaryotes, and rather than digesting them and eating them, they began living together in a symbiotic relationship. And those eventually became things like mitochondria and chloroplast in plant cells. Eukaryotic cells are the most complex cells. They have lots of different structures in them. Most eukaryotic organisms are multicellular, that is, multiple cells working together as one common organism sharing the same DNA. But there are unicellular eukaryotes out there, like the paramecium we saw in the previous slide. The DNA consists of multiple strands housed inside a membrane sac known as the nucleus, so keeping all of that DNA sequestered together. The eukaryotes contain lots of organelles, which are small, specialized structures in cells, typically bound in a membrane as well, so much more complex, again, than the prokaryotes. Example groups here include things like plants, animals, fungi, and protist. All right. Thanks for joining us, guys. Our next lesson is going to be 1-3, all life reproduces.